Well, good morning to our guests connecting from Australia, and good evening to those joining from the US and from Canada. I'm Krista Lacqua, I'm the CEO of the Coalition of Conservation, and I'll be moderating today's panel. In the spirit of reconciliation, I will begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land throughout Australia and their deep connections to the land, the sea, and community, and I'll pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. For those of you who are here for the first time, Coalition for Conservation, also known as C4C, we are a registered environmental charity. We advocate for sensible and effective energy and climate policies. We collaborate with legislators, industry experts around the world in our collective efforts to transition towards a carbon neutral economy. So today I'm very pleased to introduce a panel of female experts in clean technology. They come from a very diverse background, and they'll share insights with you into their career paths and their current roles as they possess specialized knowledge in nuclear energy. So we'll also discuss challenges, opportunities, and the important issues related to the industry, such as spent fuel safety, and the exciting prospects that nuclear might bring, especially for First Nations communities. So I'll soon introduce each panelist, and they will briefly describe their professional journey. Then we'll start an interactive conversation, and if you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box. Now, before I introduce our speakers here, I just want to share the background behind the idea of the webinar today. So in February this year, I had the opportunity to join Shadow Minister for Energy and Climate Change, Ted O'Brien, and a great team of Australian experts on energy on this fact-finding visit to the United States and to Canada. And the main objective of the trip was to conduct due diligence on advanced nuclear energy, with particular focus on small modular reactors, SMRs. Now, this visit was incredibly enlightening for me because I had the chance to learn about the exciting new technology, but also understand the experiences of both countries. And during the visit, I had the privilege of meeting suppliers like GE Hitachi, Westinghouse, NuScale, and I also engaged in discussions with Democrat and Republican congressmen and women, thought leaders from think tanks across the ideological spectrum, left and right. And I was very surprised to witness the overwhelming bipartisanship support for this form of energy in Canada and the US. I had the opportunity to meet many female engineers, corporate leaders, and community figures who were very actively involved in the nuclear industry. And this experience then inspired me to initiate this conversation with some of these remarkable women, focusing on how STEM enriched their careers. So today we're very fortunate to have here some of these outstanding ladies joining us for our webinar. And I'm very pleased to welcome our international guests. Joining from Ontario, well, not Ontario, you're in where are you now, Emily?
New Brunswick.
Well, she's from Ontario, Emily Witten-McInnes. We've got Taryn Roski calling from Saskatchewan, Professor Tina Solomon-Hunter from Sydney, and we're waiting for Alicia Duncan to join us from DC or from wherever she is around the world. Until Alicia comes, we can start our conversation, but I'll ask you first, Emily. You're a descendant of the Wittangs and a specialist in Indigenous law and engagement. So it'd be great to hear from you about your career trajectory. What are the responsibilities you hold as, let me remember this, Chief Emeritus of Curve Lake First Nation? And some insights, what motivated your involvement in the nuclear sector?
Absolutely, thank you. So I was a lawyer before I went into being the chief of my community, and one of the issues we have in Canada in our First Nations is access to clean drinking water. So I wanted to run for leadership in our community to help solve some of those problems. Never in my life did I think I would be participating in the energy sector, let alone advocating for nuclear energy. So it's been a surprise for me. While I was the chief of Curve Lake First Nation, and I don't know how the First Nations in Australia work, but in Canada we have an election and we elect our chief. So I was elected as chief in 2019, and there was a new process to pellet uranium in my First Nations traditional territory, so a city nearby. And I started looking at what that meant. I was going to advocate against it. I didn't want nuclear processes happening in our traditional territory. And the more I learned about nuclear, the more I came to realize that it was something that we really needed in order to fight climate change. And I started paying more attention over the 3 years I was chief to what's happening with climate change and why it's happening and how we're going to reduce the impacts. And I wanted clean drinking water for my children to be able to live in our community. And I realized that clean drinking water wasn't enough. I had to also find a way to help the earth not be in this climate crisis in order to move forward. So I ended up learning a great deal about nuclear energy and became a really big supporter of it. Part of my journey was learning about wind and solar as well. And I have some concerns about that I think need to be talked about more broadly in order to find the right mix. And I think it really needs to be a mix. So thanks, Christina. That's how I ended up here today. And I'll flip it back to you.
Summary. Thank you. That was a great summary and how inspiring. Taryn, what is, you're a member of the, let me remember how to say that too, the Lac La Ronge tribe or Indian band, and first Northern woman jet bore system operator. A lot of people don't know what that is, but can you share your journey with us? How did you attain this position, and I know you work in a mine. How do you feel about working in a mine?
Yeah, so I work for Cameco Corporation. I've been with them for 13 years now. I have a little bit of a different story getting into mining and STEM. I really didn't like school, and I took the easiest path possible. And in my home community, we're very connected with the mining company. They do a lot for us and vice versa. We give back to them a lot. And they had courses offered in La Ronge for radiation technician. And I took I actually went to school to be a geological technician, but there ended up not being any jobs for that. So I got hired on with Cameco and did on-the-job training to become a radiation technician. And I did that for 10 years. And that's all like doing monitoring underground to make sure that all the workers are safe. Like that's like Cameco's biggest thing, is that we always want to make sure that people are safe. So I had a really important job there. But after 10 years, I wanted more. And throughout my career, I was able to try a few different things. I surveyed for a year underground. I was an environmental technician for a year. And then once I moved over to Cigar Lake, there's 4 different mines in northern Saskatchewan based around mining. So I worked at 3 out of the 4. And when I moved over to Cigar Lake, they have a very specialized drill underground, which there's only 3 in the world, and all 3 are at Cigar Lake. And so I applied to become a JBS operator and hawed about it for a while, and they finally decided to give me a chance. And I've been doing that for the past 3 years, it's really interesting because we have such a unique underground or like ground at Cigar Lake. It's all sandstone. So in order to be able to extract the ore, we have to freeze the ground first, and then we go in and use, it's essentially like a big pressure washer. We go underneath the ore body and drill up into the ore body, and we turn it into a slurry, and it comes down and goes into a slurry tank. And then from there, it goes on into the processing area, where then it'll eventually make its way into the milling process.
Sounds like a real adventure on a daily basis for you, Taryn.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's an amazing story as well, and I want to hear more about it. But you said you're about to, there's a big storm coming your way, so
yes. So if I disappear, that is why.
I hope not. Now, Tina, she's the one joining us from, we have an Australian on the line as well, and she's a professor of energy and resources law. But Tina, not many people, and I read this the other day, not many people would know that you jumped out of a broken helicopter, let me get that right, and onto an oil rig in the North Sea, and that you were once anti-nuclear, Tina. Now you are working in the nuclear industry. So how did you find yourself in that position? You're muted.
It was going to be somebody.
Yeah, it's always going to be that one in the room.
It's always the one person.
Which is always the other one that goes, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah, thanks, Chris. Sorry, I thought I'd put it on mute because my computer was buzzing, but it's all good. Yeah, so I came to STEM very early and then left STEM. So for a long time, when I was young, I wanted to be a vet. but somebody forgot to tell me that you need physics and chemistry and maths, none of which I was very good at. And so I went off to university anyway, because I really wanted to go to Sydney Uni. So I ended up doing a Bachelor of Arts, which ironically, you could do science subjects. So I did geology and earth sciences and that, and ended up as a geologist and was working on naval ships. We had naval research vessels. So I wasn't in the Navy, but we worked on naval research vessels. Then I got injured at work and then ended up becoming a librarian, which was fun. Actually very scientific, but boring, like super boring. And apparently you can't talk, which I never knew. But anyway, then I sort of decided that was so boring. I did law, and then I'd found my place. And what's really interesting, I did my PhD overseas, and overseas in Europe particularly, law is actually a science. It's not a arts subject. But I quickly sort of got into petroleum, offshore petroleum law, and did a lot of the technical stuff. So things like well integrity, platform safety, those sorts of things. And it was actually when I was on my way to a platform in the North Sea, and the helicopter's tail rotors gearbox was playing up, that they sort of said, you know, you need to jump. I'm like, I'm not leaving a perfectly good helicopter and jumping onto the deck of an oil rig, because he couldn't get down. He's like, it's not a perfectly good helicopter. Now jump. So that was the last time I was on a rig, actually. I just thought I was getting too old for this. So
and it wasn't your choice just to jump.
No, it wasn't a choice. I didn't sort of wake up and go, I think I'm just going to jump off an oil rig. I'll jump onto an oil rig. No. But what brought me to where I am today, and in fact, what made me do my PhD, was 20 years ago, I came to this just as Australia was sending the last of its manufacturing offshore, we had a big company called Pacific Dunlop. It makes Bonds, you know, Bonds underwear and Bonds t-shirts and Dunlop shoes and these sorts of things. They sent it offshore to China. And I looked around and all I could see was Australia digging up things, sort of the Canadian story in lots of ways, digging stuff out of the ground, becoming somebody else's supplier of ore, but not much else. We had no manufacturing. We relied on education and we relied on tourism as our funding. And well, look where that got us during COVID. Mm. And it was this idea that basically Australia had nothing left to offer my children, and that needed to change. So that was what really made me go into the resources and energy and trying to make sure, and I did my PhD on how we as the people who own the resources can get something back, which all was, you know, not going terribly well until COVID struck, and the energy transformation and the energy transition really saw that we had to do something more. And I left, I went overseas, I was working in Aberdeen, the oil and gas capital of Europe. And then I could see the changes coming in my country. And then what the dilemma in this country is today is that it's fantastic. We're going back to our manufacturing roots. That's what COVID really taught us. But then we're trying to transition to solar and wind. And, you know, Canada and Australia are very similar. We're very big countries with our population quite spread out. Our population on the eastern half of Australia is spread out over 4,000 kilometres from north to south. And we're essentially relying on wind and solar to get there. And we're not going to get there. I think any scientist who thinks that we're going to get there on wind and solar is kidding themselves. And the other thing is the impact of wind and solar on the land, the lack of ability to recycle it, and the child exploitation and forced labour for all the minerals. There's a whole range of things that goes into wind and solar that are extremely destructive. And I just get this feeling we're kicking the problem down the century in our rush to get to wind and solar. And I think we need to look at nuclear as a very viable alternative. And I've seen it work in First Nations in Russia, in northern Russia, in the Arctic area. I do a lot of work in the Arctic. And so I think it's a really important place to start looking for real solutions for the energy transition. And that was way too long, wasn't it?
That's very interesting. Let's touch on the Indigenous perspectives, actually. We lost Taryn, but we've got Emily with Indigenous background. But why are the Indigenous perspectives so important in this conversation surrounding energy and specifically nuclear, especially in Canada?
That's a really big question, Christina, and I have many answers for it. So maybe I'll start with one or two, and we can build from there. For me, my community members have taken care of Canada for a really long time. We know how the different species interact. We know how climate change has impacted it in the past. We've got, you know, generations and generations of knowledge about and observation, which is the foundation of science. We have generations and generations of knowledge of how the land works. And so I think that's why First Nations, Indigenous communities have to have a part in these conversations about energy, because we have watched the land grow and change for so long. So we can talk about what the impacts are going to be and what it's going to look like and what's happened in the past. And I think that's really, really important. But I also, in Canada, the rights of Indigenous people have been enshrined in our Constitution. So Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution says that Aboriginal and treaty rights will be protected and remain, and we have those. So in order to start a new process that can impact the environment, the Canadian government has to have conversations with our community and accommodate our concerns. Nuclear hasn't been built in a really long time in Canada. We built it in the 70s and 80s, and we haven't built it since. And so any nuclear will be new, and therefore has to go through this process of having conversations with First Nations about what it's going to look like. So there's a saying in Canada, there's no net zero without nuclear, and we've added on to that, there's no nuclear without First Nations. So maybe those are my two big answers, and we can get into them a little bit more if you'd like to, or I can leave it right there.
So there's a positive feeling overall about nuclear in your community. Obviously wasn't always there. Something must have changed at some stage.
Yeah, I don't know that there's a positive feeling about nuclear at the moment broadly across Canada. I mean, we have so many different Indigenous groups across the country, and there's not nuclear in each of our provinces. So Ontario, New Brunswick, and Saskatchewan are the three provinces that are, Ontario and New Brunswick have nuclear, and Saskatchewan has made a big commitment to building new nuclear. So those conversations are ongoing. But I think, jumping back to what Tina said in the beginning, we have to build an understanding of the consequences of other energy types. People get nervous about nuclear waste, but nobody's talking about the wind and solar waste, byproducts and end of life and environmental impacts and the amount of mining that has to go into the batteries necessary to operate those. And so I think that the Indigenous people that I've spoken to have a fairly positive perspective once they've taken the time to learn about nuclear energy, the importance of it. And one of the interesting things that I've been learning about recently is the number of medical isotopes that are produced in nuclear reactors and how important they are to cancer treatments. And I find this fascinating. They stick some minerals or ore into a nuclear reactor, and we come out with medicine. The processing of that, and it only lasts for so long. So one of the big ones is Moly-99, and it goes into a reactor, and once it's processed, it has to be used within a certain number of hours. So right now, it's primarily produced in the Netherlands, and you have to ship it from the Netherlands across the world within the amount of time that you can use it. So there's a huge amount of extra waste that happens because transporting it across those distances is really difficult. So I get excited about small modular reactors, which are, not tiny by any means, but they're smaller than the big reactors we have in Canada right now. And the opportunity to create processing facilities for these medical isotopes that have, really significant life-changing impacts. So now I feel like I've spoken for a long time.
It's interesting you've touched on isotopes, because not many people are aware that the nuclear industry also provides isotopes, and I mean, it's a very important part of what they do. But I was wondering more about the whole bipartisanship, because when I was very surprised to see in the US and in Canada, generally speaking, the Democrats in the US, as well as congressmen and women from the Republican Party, all agree that nuclear should be part of their energy mix. Whereas in Canada was the same, even stronger, I suppose, support from all sides of politics. But I'm wondering how they got to that stage of realizing, the importance of nuclear when it comes to becoming a carbon neutral country, and the importance, I guess, from a national security perspective, because energy security is very much linked to national security and vice versa, which is what Tina was talking about before, that it would probably actually be very beneficial to renewables if we developed a civil nuclear industry in Australia, because it's complementary and one assists the other. I'm not sure that you agree with that, Tina, because I know you're
I think that if you going through the process of licensing a nuclear site, even on a brownfield site, so say you were to take a coal generating power station and convert that to a nuclear power station using small modular reactors, there would be an incredibly large environmental impact assessment that would need to occur. And I think anytime you did, and it would take time, and if you did that we know that would be very comprehensive. What we've got at the moment, and this is so much like the coal seam gas of the 2000s, this huge race, this huge pressure to wind, solar. We're consuming our land with solar. We're putting up wind both on the onshore and offshore zones, and we're hurrying because we've now got this target, 43% reduction of 2005 emissions by 2030. What's happening is the government is essentially putting the federal government is putting state governments in a position where they've got to approve. And this is having extremely harmful impacts on two things. First of all, on the land itself. Okay, because what it's doing is there's no real spatial planning, land use planning going on. There's this hurry to get it on the ground, if you like. And then the second thing is that we're not considering the Indigenous rights and needs. Certainly, there's what has to happen in terms of the Native Title Act on relevant land, but there's not this holistic approach. And I think if we were to step back and really start applying good practice, which we have to do for nuclear, then I think every industry would benefit. But, at the end of the day, I'm with Emily in that I think that it's very, very dangerous to go down the path of wind and solar, given the lack of ability to be able to effectively, dispose of it at the end. It's going to be an enormous problem for the next generation. We talk about this concept of sustainability, and you can ask 5 people, what is sustainability? And they'll all give you different answers depending on their perspective. But I think it would be really good for us all to remember to go back to the Brundtland Commission in 1987 said this. It was about environment, it was about social, it was about economic, and together what they did for the next generation. So the whole idea of sustainability is not now, it's the next generation and the one after. It's called intergenerational equity. And the fundamental concept of intergenerational equity is this. Are we giving to the next generation, whether it's First Nations, whether it's non-First Nations, an earth that is as good as or better? And an economy and our social, a whole thing. And quite frankly, I think the answer today is no. Because what's going to happen is, assume a generation's 25 years. In 25 years, the first of those solar and wind that have just been hurriedly put up are going to be due for removal. We're not going to be able to recycle them. They're going to go into either landfill or they're going to be shipped off to Africa. They're going to leach contaminants into the earth. And they're going to start yet another cycle of destruction, the likes of which we've already seen. And that's without the damage to agricultural land, to First Nations land, to, it's going to be an incredibly difficult scientific problem that we're just kicking down. And I really agree with Emily's view too about, the need to listen to First Nations learnings from the land. We're finding in Australia, after the 2019 and 2020 bushfires, that surprise, surprise, we've turned to our Indigenous communities and said, how do you manage fire? How have you managed fire in our grasslands and in our lands for the last 40,000 years? And there's now a move to bring Indigenous fire management in. So I absolutely agree with you, Emily.
Well,
Thank you.
Emily, but there's challenges in every form of technology that we're putting out there to reduce emissions. I mean, of course, the renewables have challenges with recycling at the moment. One day they'll get there. But going back to nuclear, which I think, one of the biggest worries that people, not just Australians, but around the world, is that how do we deal with nuclear waste in the future? And because at the moment there is no permanent solution for that. So managing radioactive nuclear waste presents, as we know, unique challenges. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that, Emily, because you told me you're quite comfortable with nuclear waste.
I've become very comfortable with nuclear waste, but before I get there, I want to just sort of tell the story of Ontario and the province that I'm in, and how we've got an energy system now that has no coal emissions on it, which is pretty exciting. We are primarily hydroelectric, and we're lucky we have enough water to be primarily hydroelectric. And then nuclear is, I think we're 50% hydroelectric and 40% nuclear, and then 10 at any given time, 10% wind and solar. And so I think it's important to have that mix. But I love the energy security in Canada of being able to mine uranium in Saskatchewan, process it in Ontario, and put it into a nuclear reactor. And I think that's so important. And then people get really nervous about nuclear waste and spent fuel. And I've now had an opportunity to tour a major CANDU reactor. Those are the nuclear reactors we have in Canada. And look at the spent fuel coming out of it. And I've had a couple of really important epiphany type moments where you can see all of the waste that's come out of a nuclear reactor. It's sitting there, it's contained, it's in one spot. And that's really reassuring. It's not leaching into the ground from a solar panel. It's not being emitted into the air as a greenhouse gas. It's all tied up in these nice, tidy little boxes. So it's very stable. So it has to be kept cool for about 10 years. So it sits in these cooling pools at the sites, and then it gets moved into a dry storage facility, and it just sits there. And it could be left above ground forever if we wanted to, and it degrades over time. And I think when we talk about nuclear waste, we get really hung up on radioactivity, and we forget that degrades over time and goes away. So eventually it won't be a problem anymore. And depending on how much of the energy you've used from the uranium, that amount of time can be different. But nobody's talking about how long heavy metals hang around. And so heavy metals are in our systems, whether it's biomass systems or water tables, forever. And they never go away. And they have cumulative impacts that are really, really problematic. And so I think we need to look at all of those and have a conversation about all forms of waste in order to be comfortable making an informed decision about what type of waste we find acceptable. And so that's my perspective.
Yeah, I would agree completely with that. I think if there was as much knowledge and as much awareness of the waste from other forms of energy, that would be, really concerning to communities. I mean, we have to think about things like the Love Canal in the US. And, so many communities, I mean, even in our own community here, we found heavy metals in the communities. In Northwest Queensland at Mount Isa, you can't collect rainwater off your roof and drink rainwater because the heavy metals on your roof are so bad that they would cause, death. So people are not allowed to have rainwater. So this is where people are living in a community now. And the biggest problem we've had to date is about responsibility. Who is responsible for the heavy metals getting in our water, for the recycling after, big things like turbine blades and solar panels are finished, petroleum installation, offshore petroleum installations. Nuclear, as Emily said, nuclear is about taking responsibility for its own waste. And it's the only industry really that does. And if a source of power is such that it creates waste that, although toxic, absolutely, but it is addressed responsibly and within the industry in an open and transparent manner, then I'm all for it. Because at the end of the day, the lack of transparency and the lack of responsibility is what worries me more. And we've only got to look at bioaccumulation. So things like pesticides. Think about Rachel Carson's The Silent Spring. We're seeing it in many places where something is done and then we see the impact and effects of it. So, for instance, in Europe, they've banned glyphosate 360, which is a very common chemical that they use in agriculture. And why have they banned it? Because it gives bees Alzheimer's. I know that sounds really stupid, but bees forget where their nests are, where their hives are. So they go pollinating, which is great, but then they forget to go home. So these hives are being destroyed. Now, we all know, we've all seen the bees movie. We all know that without bees, the world doesn't live. But it's this responsibility of what we're putting out and what its impact can be that is, I think, fundamental to the energy problem. Okay, we're all hung up on hydrocarbons and their impact, and rightly so. But I want to pose a question to you. And the question is this: when our forefathers embarked on the journey of using hydrocarbons, did they truly know what the impact would be on the environment in terms of climate change, that sort of stuff? And I would say that most people would say, no, they didn't. They didn't have the science. Now let's fast forward to today. Do we know today what the impact is of wind and solar and the heavy minerals and the decommissioning and all of that? Do we know what that impact is on the earth today? And the answer is yes, we do. So that brings up the question is, well, is this ethical? Don't we have a responsibility to explore forms of energy that don't have this sort of impact because they are so well cared for? And that's one of the things that's turned me to nuclear.
But then some people might argue, though, that the lead time for nuclear is not worth pursuing it here because we don't have an existing industry, Tina, and there's some sort of merit in this argument because the lead time is still, and that's difficult to actually say without having an industry here and having started the regulatory process. But
I disagree with that because we do have a regulator, ARPANSA, Australian Radioactive and Nuclear Protection and Safety Authority, ARPANSA. We've got ENSTO, which is the sort of operator. We have a nuclear reactor here, the Opal reactor at Lucas Heights. We have all of the fundamentals here. Not only do we have that, but there was a bill in Parliament last week before, and a report will be out on Friday that has actually made ARPANSA, our Nuclear Safety Authority, the advisory body to the new Australian Submarine Authority,
right,
and the regulator. So we have it here. We have the Safety Authority, we have a regulator, we have a reactor, we have radioisotopes being produced here. Emily, I thought it was really, really important what you said about the medical isotopes. One, having been one who has had I think I'm up to about my 10th or 11th CT scan and about my 20th MRI scan, I can fundamentally say that medical isotopes have saved my life on a number of occasions. And in fact, it was only last week that galvanadium, whatever it's called, was being injected through me. And you're right, these medical isotopes are amazing, but they're not without their own waste. And in fact, Australia is looking at and developing a nuclear it's called the National Radioactive Waste Management Facility to provide a centralised disposal area. And they're looking at sort of, the area of South Australia. And South Australia is very active in this. Australia is going to nuclear submarines. Why can't we be developing a civilian nuclear alongside it? And one of the really interesting things is you talk about lead time. And this is the thing that I think this is purely my observations, and that is we are going too fast for wind and solar anyway. What's the hurry? Because of some arbitrary target? Are we going to trap the next generation and the generation after into wind and solar just because we said, oh, it takes too long to put nuclear? Within 15 years, we could have a thriving nuclear industry well before the 2050 deadline.
I completely agree, Tina. I think that's a really great point. I've never been one to say, well, I'm not going to do it because it's hard or it's going to take too long. Just not in my personality. And I think we need more of that resiliency. We need a system. Yeah, make wind and solar. I have issues with wind and solar, but I think they need to be a part of the mix. Despite my issues with wind and solar, I think they need to be a part of an energy mix. And I think maybe there's ways to bridge the gap between now and when you need nuclear. But I don't see a huge amount of ability to cover the energy demands of manufacturing without having nuclear in a grid. I don't see it.
Absolutely.
And look, Alicia joined us.
Yes.
Hi,
Alicia. You might have got the time wrong. You're muted.
Well, you heard me frantically screaming. I'm so sorry.
We were having a big discussion here on the nuclear sort of possibilities for nuclear in Australia, but you're calling from Washington in the US. You haven't spoken yet, so I'd love for you to give us a brief sort of hello, who you are. You have the most incredible CV. You've worked in human resources, labor relations. You worked as a diplomat. You worked for the OECD Nuclear Agency. So I just want to hear from you what inspired you to support the nuclear energy industry, and what's your current role within the Department of Energy in the US?
Sure. First, thank you for having me be a part of this conversation. I appreciate Chief Emily for sharing my information with you all and connecting me with such an amazing conversation. So thank you to the organizers. Nuclear gained a special place in my heart because it does so much. In terms of the support for an argument of being able to diagnose and cure cancer, to offer treatment for various medical illnesses, to be able to clean water, to be able to irradiate food, to be able to provide, of course, electricity, to decarbonize the transportation sector. And the list goes on and on. And when we think about what the opportunities are around nuclear power, they're endless. And I think that's why it's really important that we share a messaging that there's an opportunity in the sector for everyone, no matter what your background, and that there's a need. Because when we look at climate objectives, when we look at energy security, when we look at quality of life and basic daily needs, nuclear supports all of those things. And therefore, that's how I became such a huge proponent of it, because I was able to understand how nuclear impacts my everyday life and how others' quality of life could be impacted by nuclear.
That's great. And within the DOE, what's your actual, what do you actually—
You did ask me that. I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Nuclear Energy Policy and Coordination. And so my job is to work on those relationships around the world with countries looking to deploy nuclear, countries already deploying, and see how we might make sure that it is done so in a safe, secure manner.
And so what are you seeing from an international perspective? What's happening to the industry? Is it growing, not growing? Is that support?
I think that there's definitely a support and excitement because we have so many advanced technologies on the horizon that we will see deployed this decade. And they have so many of those non-electric applications that I spoke about. This is an incredibly exciting time. And we all recognize, given the events in the world, specifically in Ukraine, the energy security is extremely vital to national security. And so then we have to look at all of the implications of having a safe and secure form of baseload energy as we look to meet those needs.
I think one of the interesting things too, coming out of what you were saying about Ukraine, is nuclear is that one energy generator that nobody's keen to really mess with. Like even the Russians, as you know, mad or as bad as you want to think the Russians, they really don't particularly want to mess with the generating capacity and nuclear facilities. I mean, facilities in the Ukraine are still operating or have just been shut down.
Well, they've been shut.
Yeah, shut down.
Yeah. Is someone jumping in to say something?
Yeah, I think that the Ukraine is one of those success stories we don't talk a lot about. Not because it has been left alone, but because it's been shelled and cut off from electrical grids and completely abused for a year and a half, and there hasn't been a major issue. Touch wood. I think that that's an incredible success story. And I think partly because people are respectful of how serious an issue it can be, but I think also because we've gotten really good at managing it. And I don't want to undermine the amount of work that I know has gone into maintaining a stable system there, because I have read a little bit about it, and it seems like there's a lot of people working in really terrible circumstances to keep it from having a major issue, but it hasn't had a major issue after being shelled and attacked and cut off and fires and all of those things.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, the Ukrainians have been just stellar in that regard, and being able to endure and persevere with all that has happened with those facilities.
There's a question here that came up. Alicia, there was a question from somebody who's concerned about how SMRs especially cope in bushfire situations or, severe temperatures and fires, because that's something that affects Australia.
Mm-hmm. Well, small modular reactors with this advanced technology, one of the defining characteristics are the passive safety features. And so therefore, Fukushima would never happen because these advanced reactors are basically walk-away safe. So that means that they're going to go ahead and shut down. They don't need any outside or personnel interference. There's no people component to it to have to make these types of decisions. It's automatically going to shut itself down and won't need a human being to come there and the next day or whatever to be able to do anything. And so in that regard, I think that we have learned a lot of lessons, not only from Fukushima, but in continuing to improve upon previously existing technology, because some of the new technology has been learned from the advances of others. For instance, BWRX 300 or the Westinghouse small modular and micro reactors. So therefore, I think a lot of the global lessons learned as these advancements continue, not only with American technologies, but others, I think that there are great opportunities to learn lessons as to make sure the small modular reactor is going to be able to have all of the necessary features so that it will not have any of these accidents, and then they're designed beyond base accidents. So therefore they have taken into account all of these. And I think that, you know, this is really a great example from learning from such a tragedy as the events of 3/11.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is other industries have not learnt from that to a large extent. So if you look at, you know, we were talking about wind and solar, we have an awareness of what needs to be done, and we have essentially sort of put that aside in terms of the circularity and in terms of, you know, protecting people from the harm generated with all the heavy minerals and heavy metals. But what is interesting, what you touched on, was learning from accidents. And what are you going to do about it? What's really interesting is the petroleum industry, the offshore petroleum industry. After Piper Alpha, we turned on our head the way that we manage safety. And ironically, in the UK, where they've never had another major incident like, or major catastrophe like Piper Alpha, they use something called the safety case. And of course, what is the fundamental basis of managing nuclear? The safety case. To be able to implement that is fundamentally important, to have a fundamental understanding of that. And of course, in the US, Deepwater Horizon did not use a safety case. I want to make that very clear. And there was and still is a resistance to using safety case in the offshore industry, petroleum industry, but that's not the case in nuclear. And the beauty of Australia is that we understand and we know the safety case well. We've used it. We imported it from the UK. What's really interesting, and probably my biggest shock in my 20 years of working in law, my biggest shock is that we don't use it now for offshore wind. And it's astonishing, because somebody's going to die. And then we're going to have to revisit the safety system. And then we're going to get back to what we already use in nuclear, which is the safety case.
But here's the thing, though. In nuclear, I would argue that it's the one that required that people be thinking about it, because nuclear came with a stigma, and nuclear came with previous accidents, which people deemed it to be unsafe. I don't think people have that same view of.
I agree. And that's why we're having trouble with getting a sound and robust safety system offshore. I mean, I was involved for a long time, for 4 years, in getting offshore wind safety and offshore as part of the offshore wind law. You know, I did multiple submissions, worked with people from the UK. The UK doesn't use safety case for wind either. Exactly what you're saying, by the way, Alicia, is that it's not important enough. It's just a couple of people that go out and tinker on a few little things and then get off. All the big problem with petroleum is about the volatility of compounds, or all the big problems in nuclear is that because it can blow up, because it just suddenly does. You know, there's all these preconceptions. Right. The way that we are going to end up is that somebody's going to get killed, and there's regulatory gaps all over the place. And we're going to go, oh, whereas I think you're right, Alicia, and you, Emily, is that, you know, we've got something here where it's really tried and tested. We've looked at all the foibles and we've gone, okay, let's address them from an environmental point of view, from a safety point of view.
So Alicia, you know, when I was in the US and Canada visiting different sites, and I didn't feel like communities and the general public suffer from the same anxieties as we do in Australia, perhaps because you're used to a nuclear, you know, industry. And I discussed that with Emily, you know, even First Nations, I felt when we met them that they were quite welcoming of the new technology. But some people argue here, and rightly so, that SMRs are not tested yet because they're still a concept, and you know there's been a lot of licensing happening at the moment. So what is, and a lot of people are talking about the cost and how long it takes. So is that something that DOE is across, that is, you know, what are you doing to fast track and improve the time and also the issues that we have around cost?
Certainly. Well, DOE has supported financially multiple U.S. technology developers to help accelerate their ability to bring the market to bear. And fortunately, because I will be the first to say, in Congress, there's not always bipartisan support for things, but nuclear has been one where even in the last administration, this administration, there has been bipartisan support, and there has been more legislation that has been passed to support nuclear, most recently the Inflation Reduction Act. And so all of these types of, and DOE did the ARDP, the Advanced Reactor Deployment Program, to help companies be able to 50-50 cost share. And then, to help them, because small modular reactor companies aren't like a larger reactor company with, deep pockets and an established bank account. And they needed some support to be able to bring those demonstrations to bear. And so we've had those type of opportunities to private partnership. We have currently now opportunities that provide those type of tax credits and offsets. And so therefore, the government has really stepped in to put its money where its mouth is to help bring these technologies to bear, as I mentioned, this decade. And in fact, at our Idaho National Laboratory, we are actually hosting one of the technologies, NuScale, which will have a demonstration project. And so I think the government really has to be an example now in this day and age. Before, I'll just speak for the US government, we weren't involved in industry's business. The government did its thing, industry did its thing. But now when we look at deployment opportunities, those internationally and domestically are married. So the success of one depends on the success of the other. And therefore, we have to make sure in both the domestic market that we're getting these technologies to bear, but also in the international market that we have people placing orders, we build in relationships so that these countries can step out and say, we want this technology. And I really think the government has stepped in both financially in the relationship building space and making sure that our policies, our laws support the deployment of new nuclear.
Emily, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I think I want to challenge the idea that these are new technologies a little bit. And some of them are, but some of them are just scaled down big technologies. So they've been operating for years and years, and we've just gotten better. Just like cars have, we're not driving the cars from the 70s. We're not building the reactors from the 70s anymore either. They've gotten more efficient. They can scale them down to be size appropriate. What I really like about the SMRs is that they are deployable in different areas. So you can connect multiple SMRs to a grid and spread it out so that if you have a wildfire or a major event that disconnects parts of your electrical systems, you can continue to deploy energy where that reactor is and keep life moving, which I think is really important. So and then the modularity of it, which is going to speed up the ability to build it more quickly. So you'll get the pieces and you'll put them together instead of having to pour the concrete on every single, footing and so forth. So there's a lot of opportunity to build them faster, and know that while everybody's talking about this being, exciting new technology, it's really just a sales pitch on many of these reactors, and a sales pitch that makes some people very uncomfortable. So BWXR reactors are just smaller reactors that have been operating in the US for a long time. The AP300 that Westinghouse has come out with is really just a scaled down AP1000. So, it doesn't matter what the numbers are. The point is that it's just the big technology, but smaller. And I think that.
Yeah, really but you did say for some of them.
For some. Some of them are brand new.
Right. But I'd also add on that cost savings piece that the cost savings is going to come, later down the line when we build one after the other, as with anything, after the other, after the other, after the other, after the other. Absolutely.
Yeah. And for countries like Australia, it's actually, in my view, it's actually good that we're not ready for nuclear yet. because what it means is by the time we go through all this process, and, as we're doing that, the SMRs are being developed. We'll be ready to go. We'll have that model off the shelf. Thank you very much. And if you just could ship it to the Olympic Dam near where we mine uranium, that'd be great. Put it on the ground and we'll just plug it in. Thank you very much. And I think for Australia, that will be really, really valuable. Now, I think what Australia should be doing is, as we develop the nuclear submarine program, and in terms of regulator and in terms of trying to just license sites, there are a lot of challenges that will need and must use the domestic, the civilian structures that we already have. I mean, what the government intends to do by the looks of things is that to the waterline, to the dock will be military. From the dock inwards will be civilian. There's a good chance that that's what they're going to do, which is the model that the UK uses. They've got something called the ONR, Office of Nuclear Radiation, and even places like Faslane, which is where the Trident submarines with the Trident missile warheads, that is regulated onshore by a civilian regulator. So they work together. So you've got the military regulator for the submarines, then you've got the civilian regulator, which is very different to the US. There's a whole range of reasons for that, history, secrets, blah, 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 which we don't need to worry about. But, for Australia and for the UK, this is what works. And to be honest, for Australia, we take our regulatory cues from the UK. We don't so much from the US. And this is logical. And this is what will happen in South Australia at the very least. I mean, when these submarines are being built, who do you think is going to be regulating the site where they're being built? It's a civilian facility. It's not a military facility. So it's going to have to be a civilian. So we're going to be going down that path anyway. We've got a lot of expertise. But let me tell you, our expertise is dying, like literally. I work with a bunch of crusty old men, and I don't think they'll mind me calling them crusty old men, because they are.
There's a few watching us today, so
they probably are. Bless them.
They are
okay. To all of my crusty old men. I mean, I think one's like 90 and one's like 83, and they're like, take our knowledge, have it before we die with it. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot to learn. And I think there's a place for the young and enthusiastic. And I must admit, as a woman, what resonates with me is, what am I going to leave for my children? I don't know if that's a maternal thing or if that's just a world thing. I think it's a maternal thing, because I look at my kids and I think that. And I think about, what the world would be like with nuclear as a widespread energy source, and what it would look like without it. And for Australia, and I can only speak for Australia and Canada, because I think we're very similar, I think the world is a lot more unstable and a lot less resilient without nuclear. And I think that's one of the really interesting things that I get out of the entire nuclear discussion, is what sort of, yes, we have to get off hydrocarbons, but how we get off hydrocarbons is going to set the stage for the next 200 years.
Do you agree, Emily?
Pardon?
Do you agree that it's a better world with nuclear energy in it?
I think I do. I was asked once my one word to describe nuclear energy, and it was temporary. Just like I think we always have to be innovating and critical of what we're doing and critical of what we're using, and finding what's next in order to not overuse one resource, not over pollute with one waste type. So my perfect word for nuclear is temporary.
and see, mine's versatile.
Back to it. Pardon?
Mine's versatile. Because it's not just the electricity, it's the heat as well.
Yes. Yeah, I think
I love this group.
Diversifying risk as well for us. It's important to include everything in the energy mix, so we don't put all our eggs in one basket and and have issues with that.
Yeah. So Alicia, what was yours? What did you say?
I love this group. I love this group on this panel because you all are bold and confident in your thoughts and expression of them. And if I were able to do what I wanted to do, I am a civil servant, so like all, I have limitations, but I would do a short film entitled A World Without Nuclear. I've pitched this. And a world without nuclear literally would be a world that I think most would choose not to be in if they had a choice between nuclear and non, when you look at how much nuclear contributes to. And if we just isolate the medical piece of it alone, who would sign up for that? Who would sign up to?
Out.
Hmm?
Not me.
Not many of us.
So therefore, like when people talk about nuclear and not recognizing, and I think that's where we fail, because we don't really have a good communication around the benefits of nuclear, because we're talking, or a lot of people are talking like everyone is a nuclear engineer. And when we start to talk to people as if they are either 5 or 85 and explain it in plain speak about how nuclear benefits your everyday life, I think people would have a different view. I mean, nuclear is 20% of the electricity in the United States. If we took that away just in the United States, people wouldn't be able to have those lights come on when they flip a switch. People wouldn't be able to have a diagnosis and treatment for cancer. And I can just go on and on, dental, everything. So therefore, I just, I view it very differently and with assurance that we must have it. And there are many reasons why. And when people look at, questions around safety, I mean, the science is there, but to look at the benefits, applications are there as well. So I guess I see it as a must-have, not a temporary thing.
What about
I think it's a must-have right now.
Yeah, it's really interesting because nuclear and hydrogen seem to be in a race to see who's going to come out on top. And Australia has put its bet on hydrogen. And that's really interesting. I'm not a big fan of hydrogen for a number of reasons. For me, the biggest thing for Australia is really about the water and the amount of energy you need for green hydrogen.
That's where nuclear, maybe pink hydrogen will be the answer.
But the thing is, if you've got nuclear, you don't need hydrogen.
Exactly.
The thing is, I mean, for Australia, Australia's transition pathway is about, let's go down the hydrogen path, which, by the way, is not technology that is, it's certainly not assured technology. But in order to create hydrogen, you've got to, first of all, create a whole bunch of huge amounts or huge volumes of gigawatts of power. Then you've got to use water, which is scarce in Australia anyway. Then you've got to make the hydrogen. Then you've got to transport it. So for me, there's an not economic, but a sort of an environmental reality about all of that. And I understand the desire to use hydrogen, but, I can't see how we can do it with the desperate need for water that we already have in our communities that's changing anyway because of climate change.
We're running out of time here, but how are you going with time, Alicia? I know that you're a busybody, and
no, I'm here with you. I was late, so I'll be the last one to leave.
Last man standing.
So we're going to utilize your opinion a bit more before you leave. But I just wanted to know we discuss here First Nations, and that's my last question, actually, and then we'll wrap up. But And we can do this again. We can have these chats again with you ladies and others that we want to involve. But I just wanted to hear from you a little bit about the DOE in terms of how they're considering experiences of First Nations in the US and in Canada to pursue the advanced nuclear technology or activities. How is this dialogue or interaction happening?
So domestically, we actually have people whose job that is to engage the tribe. So within the United States, and it's really. I'm sorry.
I think Emily is one of them who's interacting.
Well, I'm saying from the Department of Energy.
Okay.
So we have people whose job it is in the Department of Energy to engage the tribes. And we think it's important because as this administration has looked at underrepresentation and even inequities and previous harm done and all of the types of historical and even current disparities that have happened, this administration says that, this environmental justice and energy justice is extremely important, meaning we must look at where there are disparities and look at how they're happening and what we can do to correct them. And I think that from my point of view in the international space, the way I met Emily was working with the Nuclear Energy Agency to do a mentoring workshop for high school girls there just to, provide information and education and opportunity in terms of mentorship around STEM. And, that was my first time. And it was not that we felt like we were giving something, but we got so much. And I think if people are really keen on, being of service, that part of that is to learn, to understand, and as to the extent possible, see how we can be of support, of service to Indigenous people. And it's something that is not, you can't just do something and learn everything, but it's something that really in earnest one must commit to. I think it's incredibly important because in the United States and around the world, people have had so many harms and injustices done to them in generations of the Indigenous populations that we owe this debt. So it's not something I think is a nice to do or something to think about. I think it's a requirement because we must acknowledge and understand so that we do not continue to commit these types of atrocities against people that have been displaced previously.
Very good. We can't hear you, Emily. And strangely enough, you're not muted, so I don't know.
Oh, we've lost Emily as well.
Yeah.
We lost her?
I think it's the internet connection. Oh, now you're muted.
Nope. No, we still can't hear you.
Oh my goodness. We'll have to leave it.
Okay.
I think we heard a lot about waste, about Indigenous people and nuclear. We've heard about issues with safety. We've covered quite a bit today, and it would be great to have a second conversation in time and continue on, because that's a debate that a lot of people have still lots of concerns around nuclear, including myself. But I'd like to conclude by saying it's such a great pleasure to have women from all over the globe, in this case here from the US and Canada, who are very strong women and in the STEM sector, which is we're trying to promote here for ladies to be more part of it, more active in the energy industry as well, in the energy sector. So I'd like to express my gratitude to you panelists for sharing your knowledge, your experience, your feelings, and the valuable contribution you make to the energy sector in your countries, and to you, Tina, as well. We will do another webinar in July, so please stay tuned. For those of you who are still on the line watching, if you want to join Coalition of Conservation and receive our invitations, just go on the website, coalitionofconservation.com.au, and register yourself, and you'll be attending all our webinars and events that we host face-to-face. I hope to meet you face-to-face one day, Emily and Alicia. We lost Taryn. I'm very, very sad to have lost her, because she was the youngest person on the panel, and I'm not being ageist here. I just wanted to hear from the youngest person on the panel, her views. I mean, she's a brave woman who really enjoys what she's doing in Saskatchewan at the moment. And I think that I just like to conclude by getting you to say, each of you to say, what is it that you think women bring to the table when it comes to the energy sector or STEM? What are the qualities or different things, or, you know, not undermining men at all, but what is it that you bring to the table, Alicia and Tina and Emily, that you feel is highly valuable to the energy sector?
Certainly. Well, thank you. And let me thank you again for organizing such an amazing discussion. Well, since you asked me what I bring to the table, well, one of the things about nuclear and the commitment that nuclear is, which can be a 100-year relationship, is the relationship itself. So before anyone would commit to be a partner in a nuclear project, there must be a relationship and a strategic partnership. And so I think that the importance of it comes down to the relationship and choosing a good partner. And I think that women are very much a part of great relationship building practices, working together, looking at building on strengths and supporting challenges, and making sure that everyone is valued on a team. And so I think women bring that to the conversation. And at any time that people think that a woman doesn't have a place in the nuclear conversation, then you're leaving out 50% usually of a population. And that means you're already at a deficit of having that input into something as important as nuclear.
Great. Tina, what are your thoughts?
I think what women bring is two things. First of all, you know, good education that's based on science is valued in anyone. So that makes us equals. Okay. And equality, I think, is really important, whether it's gender related or not. And I think taking the gender out of it is actually better in that respect. But I think certainly from my point of view, what I brought to what I was doing was this perspective on the future. It's a bit like political parties. Generally, thought is not always given to much beyond, you know, the financial quarter or the goals or accomplishments. Women are big thinkers. We have to be, for a whole range of reasons. And I think women think big with a long-term strategy in mind. I mean, you know, we're the ones that wake up in the middle of the night looking at our children and go, oh, I wonder if you're going to be a rocket scientist. You know what I mean? Whereas dad sort of says, hope you get that game this week. You know, we're the big long-term thinkers. And I think that is a skill women excel at. And I think that's what I bring to the table. I can envisage scenarios, because I've done it 100 times for my family, who's going to die doing what. You know, we're scenario builders, we're long-term planners, we're long-term thinkers. We bring that to the table combined with the equal skills that we have. And I think we bring a really good framework to build something.
Amazing. Thank you. And Emily, I hope we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Emily?
Yes.
Yes.
We can that for you.
Wonderful.
Oh, yeah.
Perfect. You can hear me? Now I'm that one. Can you hear me now? I think I have two little boys, and before I had children, I would have said that there can't possibly be that much of a difference between genders. And as a mom of boys, they are incredibly different from my little sisters, who they're 10 years younger than me. I watched them grow up. They're so significantly different. So,
even just to play a better game, to have a better conversation, to be challenged on the way that you think. I think having women in that conversation is important. And if you think about sports teams, you don't play your best game when you have, you know, the easiest time. You play your best game when you're challenged. So if we challenge each other to think better, then we're going to do better. And I think that goes for women and Indigenous people around the world, and all perspectives and all views. And I think we need to be making space for those different viewpoints and accommodating them and answering them, and, you know, playing our best game is really, really what I think it comes down to.
That's fantastic. Diversity of gender and thoughts, and diversity in the energy mix. We need both. We need diversity. Well, that's it for today, ladies. I'll let you all go because I know it's evening for you, and we're going to meet again soon. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I really respect what you're all doing. Really want to keep in touch. So let's make the world smaller by connecting via webinars and hopefully seeing each other soon, perhaps at COP28 in Dubai. Thanks, Tina, Emily, and Alicia. And
so
Taryn,
much.
I'll tell her later that we really enjoy seeing her for the first 5 minutes.
Yeah.
See you, ladies.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for having us. Bye-bye.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. Bye.